Hey everyone, welcome to this Free Range Conversations with American Farmland Trust event. I'm your host, Greg Plotkin. Today we're talking about the farmers that can help solve the West's deepening water crisis. We have two great guests with us today, Kara Heckert, AFT's Resilient Ag West Advisor, and Cannon Michael from Bowles Farming Company down in the Central Valley of California, and also an AFT board member. Before we begin, I just want to tell you a little bit about both of our guests. So before Kara was the Resilient Ag West Advisor, she was the California Regional Director at AFT. Kara has a long career working on agricultural sustainability and natural resource conservation throughout the state of California. She's helped lead local, statewide, and regional development and implementation of programs and policies that provide greater opportunities for farmers and ranchers to engage in sustainable environmental stewardship practices and protect land and water resources. And Cannon, who is our special guest and we're super excited to have, he became president of CEO of Bowles Farming Company in 2014. He's responsible for overseeing an 11,000 acre farm during California's water crisis, while also facing tougher regulations and environmental challenges. He represents the sixth generation of his family to work in the family farming business. He joined the company in 1998 when his uncle, Philip Bowles, was president. And the farm grows fresh market and processing tomatoes, field crops, including corn, melons, carrots, and onions, alfalfa for local dairies, as well as durum wheat and Pima cotton. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, great to be here.
So before we get into the conversation, I just want to set the stage a little bit. So we are in the third year of a massive historic drought here on the West Coast. Farmers, landowners, and irrigation districts are receiving some of the lowest allocations of water that they ever have before. This is forcing farmers to make difficult decisions about, if they have enough water to grow crops, and in some instances is even resulting in farmers, ripping out orchards because they don't have enough water to keep the trees alive. At the same time, there's increasing evidence that shows farmers play a really important role in helping to conserve water throughout the West through aquifer recharge and other practices. In fact, ag land may be the only asset that we have that is capable of putting more water back into our groundwater table than it takes out. And so that's the frame of the conversation right now. Before we dig in, I want to remind everyone that this conversation is live and it is about you, our viewers and supporters. If you have questions for us, for Cannon, for Kara at any point during the conversation, please just type them into whatever social platform you're viewing this on, and we'll do our best to get to them on the call today. So let's dive right in. Cannon, what is the problem we're trying to solve for? We talk about water a lot in Western states, but what's the real issue farmers like yourself are facing?
Well, I think it's important to put the whole discussion into some context. And, California just is a really unique state in terms of its Mediterranean climate, first of all. So I think you need to look at, the hydrology and the way that the state is operated, or the way that, water enters the state, much more in the north and in the mountains, and then on the valley floors where we're farming, most of the farming is, it's very dry, or, much drier. And so, we've had a long history of projects to both protect from flooding in the northern part of the state where there's maybe an excess of water, and to store some water, and then, obviously infrastructure to move water throughout the state to areas that don't get the annual precipitation to either support the population that they have or support the agriculture that we wanted to have as a state, in order to provide, employment and food and fiber and all the things that we're doing with the water. So, I think you've got an issue where we made a lot of investments in the, 50s through the 70s, maybe, in terms of infrastructure, water infrastructure specifically. And then, since that time, we really haven't made additional investments or many in terms of projects that would add to the water supply reliability. So I think we've, and at the same time, we've, of course, had a very, huge escalation in population. So, I think we've got essentially a limited resource that there's a lot of competing demands for. And, again, like I said, I don't think we've necessarily kept up the investments in the water infrastructure. And so you're seeing, again, these competing demands highlighted at a time where we're seeing, more climate instability or changing, temperatures, which, for California, if we're going to we're going to warm up and get more rain and less snow, that's a big challenge because, the snow is essentially our bank account, and then that runs out as it melts. But if we don't have it to start with, that's a huge challenge. And then another aspect, I think, is just that we've, because of the competing people and the desires to, have different outcomes, I think we've seen, sort of an erosion of trust between different groups, and I think that unfortunately there's been collaborative opportunities that have been missed. I think people are trying to come back together now and figure out how to do better, because unfortunately right now the environment is suffering, and I think farm areas are drying up a little bit, and having challenges with reliability, and that's led to surface water reliability. Issues have led to a lot of groundwater over pumping, which again is going to be addressed with some legislative regulatory changes that have happened recently. So there's a lot of challenges with California in particular. Westwide we're seeing drought conditions, but again, I think for me, I try to look at some of those different buckets of where there's problems. Unfortunately, I think not having enough collaboration history is a challenge, and more litigation money spent versus people spending money on projects. But we're seeing some examples, especially up in the Sacramento Valley. There's been some great floodplain and fish work done by some of the rice growers and other farmers in those areas. So I think the more we can highlight those positive things and work to, ultimately, to me, it's about what's the best outcome for California in the long run. I'm a sixth generation Californian. I'm a farmer, but I don't only care about farming. I care about, being able to go to the mountains and see rivers that are healthy, and, all the communities in California that we have, large and small, make up the fabric of this amazing state. And so, to me, I try to take off the hat of it's just about farming. It's about what's the right thing to do for future generations of California to come. And so, I think we've got a lot to be thankful for here, but we've got a lot of work to do too.
That was a pretty comprehensive answer. Kara, do you have anything to add to that?
I would just tag a couple items there that I would expand a little upon, because I think that was a really great answer. But I would say there is unnecessary division. But I also have seen a lot of collaboration. A lot of people actually want the same things. They just don't know how to get there because they're either in the silos of their agencies or old thinking, or just not able to come to the middle. And I have seen a lot more middle of the road approaches, which I think is a real positive. But I think a real big one that I wanted to flag is just that it's true that our infrastructure and our capacity all the way across the board has not kept up with a changing population or climate. And that goes all the way down to the farm level, where we don't have the capacity at organizations that are serving and supporting farmers. And I think that is a huge thing that we need to scale up, which I know we'll talk a little bit more later. But you combine that with infrastructure needs that haven't been met, and that creates a lot of the complications. And it is true, there's some very unique things about California, but those particular things about infrastructure and capacity are well throughout the Western United States. And so we're seeing it throughout.
And so, I mean, I think one of the things when we're talking about water in the West is that there are just a lot of competing wants, needs, desires, right? Cities need water, farmers need water, Native American tribes want certain flows for, native fish and stuff like that. So it's really figuring out how to allocate the increasingly limited water we have to meet all of these demands. I think that's one of the main issues that we talk about when we talk about water. So we have some great questions coming in, and I want to put one to you and just remind everyone that watching, we are live. We're here to answer your questions. Please just type them into the social platform you're viewing this on, and we'll do our best to get to them on the call. And so, Cannon, I think this one, maybe we'll start with you. We've got a question from Paul on Facebook, and he's wondering how much potential is there for saving water via conversion to crops that use less water to be grown?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me, ultimately, it boils down to the market is asking for certain things from agriculture. Ultimately, I'm essentially a transformer of a resource, which is water, into products that people are asking for in a marketplace. So I think it's also important to remember that every crop responds differently to different types of irrigation methods. And so, we've converted a lot of our farm to drip irrigation, which does significantly cut the amount of applied water that we use. But at the same time, we still use other methods. We actually still do some flood irrigation. And if you talk to folks in some of the conservation groups, they actually like, in our area, we sit next to a very large wetland complex. It's beneficial to have some surface water on the ground so that the birds and other terrestrial species that we have here. We've got a very diverse ecosystem here around the farm, and it's actually beneficial to have some surface water. And then also there's opportunities for that water to recharge groundwater. So it's more nuanced than just saying, like we need to do a specific crop conversion or a specific irrigation system conversion. It's a larger. Essentially, I use the right approach that the crop is best for the crop, and there's no benefit for me to overuse water. It's actually detrimental if I put excessive water onto a crop. First of all, it's costly because it's an input that we pay for, and second of all, it doesn't do the crop any good if I overwater or underwater. So, it's a balance, and again, I think the long and the short of it is, even with using a lot of the technology that we have, the conservation, what people would think of the drip irrigation, it still takes, if you break it into gallons, it still takes a lot of water to create a watermelon or a tomato or, any of those types of crops, which ultimately are, kind of the healthy crops that we want people to be eating. So, there's a component of water use. And again, I think we're complicit every day in ag water use. We are the act of putting on a shirt, the act of eating your meals. I mean, those are decisions that you're making that came from a farmer from somewhere. So again, it's part of a larger kind of conversation.
As someone who tries to grow food just in my garden in northern Nevada here, I can tell you it takes more water than you would imagine to not just keep things alive, but actually produce food that you can eat. Kara, anything to add to this question?
All I would say is that I think that I think farmers do the best that they can, but not everyone is like Bowles farming in their ability and innovation. And so I do feel like there is potential for agriculture to do more in the space of conversion to different crops, but also in water savings. So that's all I'd add.
So our next question along these same lines. So what do practices that replenish groundwater look like in the field, and what are the benefits to using them for farmers? Who wants to go first?
You can go first, Cannon.
Oh, I know. Yeah, I'm happy to always talk, so I got to be careful. But so on the groundwater replenishment, I would just say in our area. So again, groundwater recharge doesn't work in every area. For example, our area here where we farm near Los Banos, California, we have what's called it's a perched groundwater table. So there's a layer of clay that sort of traps water below the surface. So we're not a good location for that. There are some just to the east and the west of us. There are some places where that clay layer that's there is cracked and people can do that groundwater replenishment. So again, I think you need to look at it in context. I saw in the comment line something popped up about organic matter building. So those types of things in our area are what we find as techniques that are beneficial, is to improve the water holding capacity of the soil. And generally that's through, soil health practices such as, cover cropping at times can be beneficial, but we use a lot of compost and other things. We have a green waste compost facility on the farm where we're a solution partner essentially for urban areas where they're needing to get rid of their green waste, not want to put it into a landfill, which breaks off into the methane emissions if they do it that way. But we on the farm can take that material, grind it and compost it within 30 days, put it back into the field, improves the soil tilth and structure, and also helps with that retention. So, again, it's a nuanced conversation, but, I think I look at the water situation as it's, all of the above things need to be looked at. But again, some of them are locationally more appropriate than in others. So, groundwater recharge in certain areas makes a lot of sense and is a very positive thing. In our area, it's not. So we do other techniques and practices. And so that's that's my answer to that.
Kara, and I do have an example of what it looks like in the field that I can put up as you're talking here.
Yeah, I think Kenan makes a good point about groundwater recharge not being the silver bullet everywhere. This is a great example up on the screen from sustainable conservation, but yeah, using more what we'd call passive practices, cover crops where they make sense, soil health improvements. We're doing a biochar trial with an almond grower, and that will help with infiltration. Swales in the field, more what we call passive practices, where they're not a lot of economic input, but they really help with infiltration. So things like that. Honestly, things that farmers have been doing forever, and we didn't necessarily call it infiltration practices or groundwater recharge kinds of things. And and then there's the more structural things like what you just had on the screen.
Right. Great. So we want to answer your questions. You're watching this because you're interested in water in the West. You're interested in how farmers are, helping to combat this crisis. So if there's questions you have for us, Kara, Kenan, please type them into the social platform you're viewing this on, and we'll get right to them. So let's move on to our third question, and that deals with how do we scale up these practices that we're discussing. So a lot of these practices benefit everyone, right? They benefit all communities in California and throughout the West that, need ready access to fresh water. So what can we do to incentivize more farmers to use practices that rebuild our groundwater supplies?
I can take a stab at that one. AFT works a lot on trying to scale up this kind of thing in the San Joaquin Valley and all throughout the country. I think it really requires a lot of public and private investment. I think that's probably an obvious one, which I think California is doing a better and better job of, but also the federal government and providing that kind of investment. But I still see a very big void in the ability to scale up this work, and that is still technical assistance on the ground. I've said this for a long time, and the needle is moving very slowly. But what I mean by technical assistance is not every farmer has the capacity. Very few have the time. They're running a business on top of this. They don't have the time or necessarily the knowledge to navigate the bureaucracy of government programs. And they also may need technical assistance on the ground with how these practices work, when best to implement them. They need that technical assistance, farmer liaison, whether that's through NRCS, your local conservation district, or a nonprofit. And there are major parts of California, San Joaquin Valley being one of them, and other parts of the West, where there are just not enough boots on the ground. So you have more of the early adopters and the kind of innovators, but you're not going to be able to reach the kind of smaller growers, maybe English as a second language growers that don't have those same kind of ability to access those resources without those technical assistance providers. So I think that's key.
Kenan, how about you? What makes farmers like you want to try these practices out, or what can incentivize them to?
Yeah, I think, for each individual farm, like I said, the solution set could be, look a little bit different. So I think it's, appropriate to try to identify, what are the outcomes people are trying to get to for the larger picture, groundwater projects that need to happen. I mean, I think it's important to identify like a number of partners within those projects. So like multi-benefit projects where, maybe it's some infrastructure that needs to be put in that could help, a disadvantaged community with their groundwater recharge at the same time, maybe also with an agricultural aspect, or even, an environmental use of water that, would benefit from. So I think, it's those types of projects I think are going to be high on the list for being able to get some funding. And again, the on-farm specific kind of smaller type things are great. And I think they're important. Like I said, part of that, all of the above solution. But I think when we're looking at some of the deficits of potential water in the San Joaquin Valley, at least where we're farming, and seeing, as the sustainable groundwater management rolls in, there's going to be less reliance on groundwater, which has been sort of the lifeline. Not that it has necessarily been used always responsibly, but it's been there for farmers as kind of the option that they have if they can't get service water. So, we're seeing potential for a lot of landscape change here in the valley. And so, while it's really important to look at the on-farm, the more granular solutions, I would say I still tend to want to focus on, what are the larger projects that can get done that would, to Kara's point about trying to preserve and sustain, the farmland that is preservable. I think we want to be looking at how to get some of these larger projects done for the future health of the agricultural industry and the health of the valley, because so much relies on the output that comes off our farms, and the purchasing that we do of all the local resources, from parts to, fuel to uniforms to like whatever, and then all the products leave our farms to go to, stores or processing or, somewhere else. So, I mean, it's an economic generator that if we're going to lose some estimates say, 500,000 to, if not 1 million or more acres of land going out of production just in this part of the San Joaquin Valley. So, those are big changes and big numbers.
And I mean, the economic aspect is, I think, something that people who didn't grow up or maybe haven't spent time in farming communities, they don't realize that everything is interconnected. The veterinarian, the feed dealer, and especially a lot of these rural communities in the valleys, the heartbeat is really agriculture. And if you're taking land out of production, you have fewer jobs there. It has rippling consequences kind of across the landscape. We have some great questions coming in. Please keep them coming. We've got time to answer them. I think this is an interesting one I want to put to you. So, is anyone codifying water conservation practices with growers via easements or other binding contracts, like we see for carbon markets that compensate growers for cover cropping? For example, companies can buy carbon offsets to achieve carbon neutral goals. Could we see something like that in the realm of water use in the valley or in California in general?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I have not heard of anything specifically along those lines, but it could be of interest. I mean, I think just even along the lines of the carbon discussion, I mean, we're seeing more brand partners interested in their supply chain and what's happening within it. And so I think, there's opportunities potentially to have some of these kind of more creative partnerships where, maybe the brand is helping invest on the farm to, for more water conservation, or maybe the, carbon friendly practices in the soil, can generate some credits within the supply chain, source 3 emissions, issues that they might have. So anyway, I think there's all kinds of potential, collaborative, new ideas, but I haven't seen anything specifically as of yet.
I mean, Kara, what about from like a government standpoint? Like, are there programs or incentives that I guess, will encourage farmers or compensate farmers for these practices in some way?
Not in the way that the question was asked.
Sure.
I did hear recently about a land trust in Colorado that is working on agricultural conservation easements that include groundwater recharge practices as part of them. So I think there could be models out there, and I think it's where things need to go. I think, the state of California has a new program called multi-benefit land repurposing. And I believe, and I could be incorrect, someone in the comments will probably correct me, but part of that program is to provide some economic, payback to the farmers for some of the land that they may need to fallow or change. And I'm not sure that I'm exactly correct on that, but I think that's where things need to go.
Yeah, I think in that specifically, Kara, I think what people have pretty much coalesced around the idea that there's going to be a block of farmland that's not able to be left in agricultural production, or at least not the way it is currently. So the repurposing idea would be, could you build some like intelligent habitat corridors? Some of it can be converted to solar, but for those of us who are going to live in the valley, the worst outcome would be if 500 100,000 or 1,000,000 acres of land turns into, a Dust Bowl situation, I mean, that's going to be, so we need to have intelligent planning. And I think that's part of this multi-benefit, like land repurposing effort is, how do we, if the inevitability is that there's some land that needs to contract, how do we turn that into something productive? And so as a resident of the Valley, I certainly want to see that happen. And as a resident of California, I would think others would want that as well.
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, Kenan, you're in the Valley, and I'm sure you're talking about this with other farmers and other landowners in the region. I mean, and so you're really embracing the innovation, right? How to grow more with less, how to conserve water. Like, what are people talking about down there in the Valley? Like, are farmers really, are they like, this is the most important issue right now? We need to figure this out or we're not going to be able to grow food in another 3, 4, 5 years. What's kind of the tenor of the conversations amongst your farming peers down there?
Yeah, I mean, I think farmers have a tendency to, we have to be optimists because to be in this business, you have to be optimistic. But at the same time, I think we can have a fairly long list of complaints every day about the things that are bothering us. I think sort of the nature is either too hot or too cold or too wet or too dry, whatever. But, California is just an interesting place to do business, I would say. We have a really high level of regulatory compliance that is mandated by law. And, it's all things that I never would argue against, paying your workers well, protecting the environment, doing the things that if we break those laws, we're in big trouble here in California. But yet at the same time, we're seeing, more and more food coming in from, south of the border here. Mexico's imports into California and into the U.S. are increasing, at a rapid pace. And, I think those of us in California who are thinking about what the future looks like, if we're going to, if people, it's challenging because I think, we've created a system where we've sort of destroyed seasonality and we've, gotten our shelves full of food, and from wherever it is, it's, people have an expectation now that when they walk into a store, you're going to have, strawberries all the time and raspberries and,
Right.
stuff that's always plentiful. Even in our, small town of Los Banos here, you walk into Save Mart 24 hours a day and you've got, all different kinds of produce. And so again, the discussion to me a little bit has to be, how do we value like California local production and make sure that sticks around, because a lot of what we're growing are things that we're trying to encourage people to eat more of, which would be the stuff on the sides of the store versus the center of the aisle. But a lot of those types of things that are in the sides of the store, a lot of those are really mainly can be grown in California. And so, I see some of the comments about, let's eat more locally and feed locally. And, I think that's ignoring a little bit of the idea that, California is a unique resource for the nation in a way. And, maybe people would say, well, that's not our responsibility. And you could say that, but, people in other parts of the country, you're just going to say, okay, we're going to cut off your supply of lettuce and tomatoes and, a bunch of other things that we're wanting people to eat more of. And some of these other local climates, just to be honest, like they don't, because we get low annual rainfall in the Central Valley, it actually makes it the ideal place to grow things, which might sound contrary, but because if we put the water on when it's exactly how we want it to go, we'll get the quantity and the quality that other places can't do. So, if you're trying to grow tomatoes in Georgia because they get 36 inches of rainfall, that's not 36 inches of rainfall when you need it. It's
Right.
coming at times when, maybe 1 out of 10 years you get a great tomato crop, but a lot of the other times you're going to get, it's going to rain when the fruit's there and it's going to, rot in the field, or, you're not going to get it at the right time when it's setting its flowers, or, so again, it's part of this large conversation. And it's hard because, we haven't been in a time of like food scarcity or, like the stores have continued to always be full of food. And so people, the connection to farms and the connection to agriculture is a little bit eroded. And so people get ideas, I think, like, well, we can just cut out what we're doing in California and that's going to be a good thing. And I don't think it's as simple as talking like that.
Right. And and there's a dozen or 2 dozen crops grown in the Valley that are 90% or more of the total production in the US, a lot of tree nuts, stuff like that. The San Joaquin Valley and the Central Valley larger is the most important agricultural region in the nation by far, both in terms of yield and economic output. And if it goes away, I think we're going to have like people are going to feel it in the grocery store. They're going to feel it in what's available at their favorite restaurants. And so you're right. It's not just as easy as saying, let's just stop doing what we're doing there and move on. I think one of the really interesting things, and this is actually a quote that I pulled from Secretary Ross from a recent article about drought in the Sacramento Valley, actually, but we're doing really amazing things when it comes to water conservation in California. So we're using less and we're growing more. And I think that's something that I just want people to understand. Like, farmers are at the leading edge of water conservation, not always because they want to be, but because they have to be to stay in business. So I think that's something just really important to point out. Kara, lots of great questions. Thank you for everyone putting them in. Kara, I have one for you.
Great.
Has the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act impacted growers, and has the act generated financial or technical assistance or planned infrastructure improvements?
Yes, and yes. I'll expand on that. It is impacting growers, and it will impact growers. The rubber is really hitting the road on local groundwater sustainability agencies and their completion of their groundwater sustainability plans, some which are being kicked back from the state as not being adequate, some which are okay. There's already growers that are trying to get out in front of the act because they see what's going to happen as far as less water from their irrigation district or their other allocations that they're getting. So we're already seeing changes in what people are growing. We're also seeing some folks that are putting in crops before the act really impacts them. I mean, I've heard that on the flip side, like people are putting in more almonds before, something might come down the pipeline. I mean, that's just the truth. They're trying to get ahead of the regulation. It definitely, just like Cannon says, it depends on where you're at. But in the San Joaquin, you're ground zero for overdrafted basins. The act has generated a number of funding programs through the Department of Water Resources. California Department of Food and Ag has some programs for SGMA technical assistance to farmers that are in the governor's budget right now. There's also funding, a big package from the state for planned infrastructure improvements, in the billions of dollars. These are really good investments, but like Cannon said at the beginning, we are behind of some decades of not doing these things. So I would imagine that the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, it's the biggest thing to affect agriculture in recent decades. It's going to have more impact in the future. And maybe you would disagree with me on this, Cannon, than it has so far.
Oh yeah, I mean, as of this point, I don't think many of the plans have not been that have been submitted. A lot of them have been pushed back out by the Department of Water Resources for further clarification. So a lot of districts, I think, agencies have identified sort of a glide path approach of tapering off pumping over the next decade or so. But as of right now, I mean, I think during this drought, there would this current year, there's going to be a fair amount of groundwater pumped again. Yeah, so it's coming and it's looming and everybody knows, and everybody's gotten plans together. The agencies are formed. Everybody's been proactive about getting the plans and things ready. But there's just a lot of work still to be done to get full implementation, and then obviously enforcement and everything else. So it's got a little ways to go. But yeah, I think people are very mindful that it's especially in this, like a year like this, where there's a lot of scarcity, that future years like this, when groundwater is not available, that's why you can understand why a lot of land won't be in production.
Right.
Great questions. Please keep them coming. We've got time for a few more. I want to pose this one to both of you since it addresses something that we talked about earlier. So Charles on Facebook wants to know, on LinkedIn, as a city dweller, what are the best talking points that they can use to share with their neighbors and elected against water policies that prioritize urban water needs over rural ag? I want to reframe that question before I pose it to you. You both talked about collaboration, right, at the beginning of this conversation, and the need to bring people together. And so I think instead of how do we push back against, policies that prioritize urban water needs, how do we bring people together around this issue of water conservation in California that meets, everyone's needs?
Oh, that's a good one. You're putting that one on me. Well, I mean, yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I think, yeah, trying to reframe it a little bit. I would say the value of California local healthy like food production is something that I think is important to highlight. Again, we have to have the conversation about what is enough or what's too much, or those kind of things. But in general, it's also hard having these conversations when you're in the middle of like a crushing drought, because people get a mentality of like it's never going to be wet again in California, which also is something like you can't. So I mean, a lot of times there is sufficient water to have a healthy agricultural group, and then there's enough water for the environment and enough water for the urban folks. And so I just think we need to look for opportunities to preserve as much sustainable California agriculture as we can, is my goal. And I think that's the reasons is that it is the most highly regulated and does have the most protections that we as Californians have put people in power to vote for these kinds of laws. And again, that's why there's a frustration from my side when I see us bringing in more products from places that don't have that same set of standards, and then also obviously trucking things in, and all the freight impacts associated with moving a lot of other products into California. So again, it's a complicated conversation, but I don't think we want to try to pit each other against each other any more than we already have been. And so it's how do we look at like the larger whole and try to say like we want to have some good leadership that guides us through some of these challenging. And that's the other problem is California water is like a hot potato. Not many legislators really want to catch it and play with it. So it's it can be dangerous, again, because of the polarization that is out there. It's hard for people to sometimes take strong stances or be comfortable wading into a very complicated and contentious issue.
Kara, thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for taking that first, Ken. That was the hot potato I threw to you, but yeah, I would reframe it too. I think if there was a talking point to give, it would be more about educating folks in urban areas about the value of local food, but also how much we're losing, because I don't think people are aware that we're losing 50,000 acres of farmland a year in California, and have been for some time. I frequently say that doesn't seem to resonate, that message that we're losing 50,000 acres a year, because of the exact reason that people can still go into the grocery store 24/7 and get whatever they need. So there is a disconnect. We're also losing the majority of what we're losing is our most productive land. So I think it starts with education, and also that, helping to support cities in supporting the preservation of local agriculture in their planning processes. So there's a couple different ways to go about it, rather than against urban policies, more about promoting agriculturally supportive policies.
Yeah, I think we have an increasing difficulty in this country of seeing the other side of an issue, right? So folks that live in urban areas seeing the perspective of farmers like Cannon down in the valley, and even, farmers seeing the perspective of urban communities, right, who go through water restrictions, they're not able to water. And so I think it's just understanding both sides of the coin and realizing that we're all in this together, and that this divide and conquer mentality where one person has to win and one set of people have to win and the other has to lose, it's just not true. We can all do our best for each other. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're short on time, but I just want to add something. I read an article recently talking about the elephant in the room about California water, and it brought up the 80% of water that I use in the state. And see, that's problematic in itself, because that is such a just like one number with no other context of what that is providing. It didn't talk about the economy and the jobs it supports, the food it provides. It was just the number. And so I think articles like that just keep the same division going.
Right. And I think just the way that we started this conversation, right? Like farmers are one of the main stewards of land and water resources in California, but that's what they are. They're stewards. They are people that are taking care of these resources for the rest of us. They're not just doing it for themselves, their families, their businesses. They're doing it for everyone in the state and throughout the West. And I feel like there needs to be some deeper appreciation and understanding of that from urban and suburban communities across the region.
Well, I saw an interesting, just really quickly on that. I mean, I saw something recently that came out. It was a letter saying like this group of farmers is using like enough water that like half of LA would use in a whole year. But, you know, that to your point and to my point earlier, I mean, if you look at the many gallons of water is consumed in food in Los Angeles, you know, so they're looking at like domestic supply and what people use to take showers and water lawns and stuff. And they're saying like, well, compare that to what agriculture was using, but agriculture is using it to grow food that if you add on the gallons of what's consumed by Los Angelinos to survive every day, I mean, the amount of gallons of water that went to supply them with that food is like astronomical. So it's like, we're all part of it together. You know, that's the thing, like, you know, and the food is going to come from somewhere. People aren't going to stop eating. And again, so who do you want to be producing your food? You know, you are going to partake in agricultural water use yourself, you know, at least, you know, multiple times a day, probably.
Right.
So again, it comes from somewhere. And again, we can't just say like, can't just ignore that fact. And so I think we're kind of all in it together.
Well, okay, I'm gonna flip this to a very appropriate question that we just had come in. How do we stay optimistic about the future of farming when we keep seeing farmland developed into homes or shopping malls or having to be taken out of production because of drought? Like, how do we stay optimistic about the future of agriculture, you know, in California, in the Central Valley, but across the country?
It seems like an American Farmland Trust question, Kara.
All right. I am not a Pollyanna type person. You ask anyone that really knows me, but I am tremendously optimistic about the future of farming because of the new and beginning farmers that are coming into farming that I'm seeing from all walks of life and that have new ideas. And I'm not saying that the farmers that have been around aren't doing great things as well, but seeing a new generation of farmers that are being really innovative with how they're doing things. We're never going to be able to save all the farmland. We need new housing. We need places for people to live. We have a report coming out, Farms Under Threat. This is about all I can say about it, but it talks about different scenarios for how you're building out communities. And there are ways to do this where we don't have to lose as much. We're going to lose some. And there's also ways to do this where we can still put a high value on our most productive, versatile, and resilient farmland. So I've seen it happen in communities in California and the West. That's why I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because of people like Cannon. Not trying to shine you on Cannon, but people like Cannon who have really transformed how he's managing and farming his farm. I think you said when we were out there in the field, like a couple weeks ago, when you were first began farming, it was just a couple different crops. Now you have like 10 or 12, something like that, right, Cannon? Oh, really? Yeah. So I see those kinds of examples all over the place. That's why I remain optimistic. And not to go on and on, the last reason is in my 20 years in this line of work, I do see greater collaboration. There's no doubt about it. There's many more people coming to the middle and talking about innovative solutions than I saw even 5 years ago.
Let me make one point and then I'll pass it to you, Cannon. I think the thing that makes me the most optimistic is I've never met a farmer that just throws their hands up in the air and says, oh, there's nothing we can do, right? I've never met a farmer that is not tackling these challenges head on. And that is their personality, right? You encounter a problem, you figure out a way to work through it. And so that's what makes me optimistic is that I know whatever comes next, right? Whatever challenges that American farmers face, they're always going to tackle them head on, always be super innovative about it and never just give up. So that's something that makes me super optimistic. Cannon, as a farmer, where does your optimism come from?
Well, I mean, I certainly am optimistic because I feel like people, want to continue to eat and be healthy and those kind of things. And so, I mean, I think we've got a population that likes healthy food and a lot of what we can produce here in California. So I'm optimistic that way. I mean, I think when we talk about like one farm being more innovative, I mean, I think we really need to be careful about how we talk about, farming and farmers. People want to say something like big ag or like, throw out these things. Like, we're trying to live in a society where we don't generalize and stigmatize. And it seems like agriculture often faces where, that's okay to do that to farmers. And again, we're all very diverse, and, our farm is larger than some in our neighborhood, but, we have a huge diversity here locally where we've got, Italian and Portuguese and Basque and, great, lineages and histories and, even first generation farmers. So there's young and old, but I think if you look at the census data of farming, it's an aging population, and a lot of folks, don't have people coming up in the business. People have moved off of farms, and, we're seeing consolidation by outside investors coming in and buying farmland. I mean, we're seeing, a lot of changing complexion, and like some of the older groups in our area, smaller farms, they don't want to learn a new irrigation method. They don't want to invest in drip irrigation and do something that's totally new and challenging. And I think, again, agriculture, we've got a lot of variables that we deal with all the time with weather and pests and, water, all these other things. I mean, so you throw in a brand new type of, irrigation like that, if you don't know how to use it and you haven't been trained, and, it's not part of like, we've been able to adapt, but it hasn't always been easy. We've had a lot of failures and things that haven't worked, and, poor yields because we're trying something new, or, again, like I said, we've expanded into 20 different crops. We've got organic and conventional. We're doing, all kinds of different stuff, but that's not for everybody. And, like, I think that there's still value in a small, like, wife and husband that are farming, a couple hundred acres and trying to, continue their legacy. It's getting much harder in California to keep that together. And, I do see this kind of conglomeratization of people who haven't been raised in the Valley and aren't from like the communities coming in and, buying and doing things that, are concerning, to me as a longtime family farmer. But, I think we just have to be careful about the conversations about how we talk about farmers specifically, because we're each individuals and we've got our own approaches. And I think there needs to be just a little bit more respect. But, I think we can have continuing dialogues like this, and we'd like to bring people to our farm and show people what's, going on. And there's a really positive aspect of, again, transforming water into stuff that is valuable to people and healthy and, done with the right regulations and all that. So anyway, it's complicated, but I think I'm optimistic because I see more people interested in learning. So I hope people continue that learning mindset.
So I know this is a very big question to throw at you in the only minute or two that we have left in this conversation. And Kara, let's start with you. But what is your big audacious idea for solving the West water crisis? I know we all have one. Give me a dream scenario, and it could just be one idea, right? Something short and simple that you would love to see happen in the West.
You gave me this question in advance, and it's.
I did.
Okay, two things. I feel like maybe they're not big and audacious, but and a little bit of a repeat. But I think there's two really big things that have to happen, and that is public valuing agriculture for what it provides. That's a lot of what we're talking about, and that's part of our job at AFT. It's part of agriculture's job. It's part of the public's job to understand where their food and fiber comes from and what it takes. I think once the general public really puts a high value on local food, I know this sounds just kind of like a yucky answer, but I think that shifts everything. I think the second thing is also a very AFT answer, but true. Once we lose the farmland, we don't have much to work with. So I think we have got to protect as much as the land that we have. A lot of the best groundwater recharge zones are on farmland all throughout the West. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that's a great answer, Greg, but those are two of the biggies. They include lots of things, lots of bullets underneath them that have to happen.
I love it. And Cannon, how about you? It might just be that we get 1,000 inches of snow next winter, but what's your dream scenario?
I think I kind of go back to the thread I think I was teasing out in the beginning about how we as Californians come together and work together. And, I've been fortunate to have been spend a lot of time in water, and I'm on the farm all the time, but I also have been able to, I've got a great team here that allows me to get out and do some other things. But I've met, great NGO leaders in the environmental community that, have all the expertise in the world about, how to do restoration and how to figure out, biology and ecosystem problems. And it's like, those are their knowledge coupled with, farmers' knowledge, coupled with, water district leader knowledge. I mean, I think we can get people to really work together. And I think that's, it's not, well, in California, it feels audacious a lot of times. And it's, I think it's incumbent on us, kicking the bomb throwers out on all sides, because I think, there's bombastic people in agriculture and there's the same in environmental. And I think it's recognizing that if we really want to get things done, there needs to be a new trajectory for California. And it's got to be people working in the middle and building relationships and also building up some courage so that, if we've got bad actors and, criticizing or trying to tear things apart, we have the strength to push back. And, I think coming together and working together, there's money available. I think in California, we've got a $97 billion surplus and, but I think people are hesitant to give it out if they think it's just going to only one type of, project or group. And so, I think the larger benefit to California is if we can actually act like Californians and say, like, this is the type of state we want to pass on to future generations. And that's where my goals lie. And I think all of us, if we could come at it with that approach versus, I'm fighting for my silo or my, because it's just, California is just not that way. It's the place that it is because it's got a lot of diversity and a lot of amazing people. And, how do we leverage that?
Yeah, I mean, I firmly believe that we're not going to solve any of our problems in this country if we try to do it, in our own little groups or this side or that side. We have to figure out a way to come together, understand each other, and work towards a future that benefits the largest amount of people. One person doesn't lose when the other person wins. It's just not the way it works. So, Kara, Cannon, thank you so much for being with us today, for answering all the questions and for talking with us about this really important issue impacting farmers all across the region. Our next Free Range Conversations event is going to be on June 22nd. We're going to talk about how to make your farmers market an asset to your community. So be on the lookout for more information about that soon. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. We really appreciate it. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.